Hi, I'm James, and recently I gave a talk at the Royal Armouries in Leeds on guns in popular British music, which was part of the Weapons and Society 4 conference run by the Royal Historical Society. And I know that people I know have asked me, uh, what did I say? So I thought I'd actually record it. This is a slightly extended version of what I said at the time. I've gained some more information since and some feedback from some of the questions. Now, while it is very much about music, I will clarify something from the word go. For those who know me, I am not going to sing. That's probably a very, very good option as far as I'm concerned. So the scope of the talk then, what are we going to limit it to? Well, we're going to limit it to British music, and the weapons referred to have to be named. That's significant. It's no good just saying something like Guns and Roses. It has to be a specific weapon. And I'm also going to use it to look at how society has seen guns, how that has evolved. So we're going to look from the 1940s onwards. So in the 1940s, weapons were seen very much as part of the establishment. And the first real named song that I could find was this, which is Could You Please Oblige Us with a Bren Gun by Noel Coward. Now, let's be honest, you don't get much more establishment than Noel Coward. He was actually listed in the Black Book for arrest and elimination by the Nazis if they had invaded. Now, in 1940, the British Army was desperately short of weapons, particularly automatic weapons and machine guns. And this song, which takes place post Dunkirk with the Home Guard struggling to get anything, and just moving into a combat role. Now, a lot of people don't realise that initially the Home Guard wasn't called the Home Guard. They were called the LDV, the Local Defence Volunteers, or jokingly known as Look, Duck and Vanish. The idea was they initially appeared, they spotted the Germans, and then they went and basically informed the regular army. They didn't like that, and they wanted to fight. And the song, I think, sort of emphasises that really well. Dad's Army, despite being a really good tribute to the Home Guard, I think sometimes does them a bit of a disservice. They were willing to give up their lives in defence of their country, and I would advise anybody who thinks Dad's Army is purely a comedy to go and watch the episode The Battle for Godfrey's Cottage and just look at the attitudes. It's a very interesting episode. But this unit, you can see in the picture, they're incredibly well equipped. They've got a Thompson and a Bren gun. That is obviously going to be a stage shot. They weren't exactly very common, let's phrase it that way. Old kit, yeah. Major General Fuller, currently serving at that point in the Home Guard, actually had a pike as his primary weapon. It's not quite as bad as the arquebus that used at Waterloo that's referred to in the song. That would be about as accurate as, let's say, a British unit at Waterloo having Baker rifles with scopes on and firing from trenches. You know, it does get to that level sometimes. Some historical films. It's a bit of license in here, but the other bits, about referring to staves and things like that, they're entirely accurate. And as a lovely aside with quarterstaff fighting, up until, well, around this point actually, the Boy Scouts actually had a proficiency badge for riot control, where they could actually learn to use a quarterstaff. Speaking to some Boy Scout instructors, some of them are very sad that that one's vanished. But weapons weren't that common. The 1937 Firearms Act had actually stopped people owning machine guns. Yeah, they were still quite popular up until then, apparently. So by the 1950s, the weapons were seen still as an establishment thing, but there were hints of revolution occurring. Ireland had hotted up. You had the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya. You had Malaya against the communist insurgents. So they were starting to be seen a little bit for repression, and this is where this song comes in. Sean South of Gary Owen, sung by the Wolf Tones, which is a really good pun because they named themselves after the Irish leader Wolf Tone. Now, the song about Sean South is based on a historical event. He was killed by the RUC, pretty much as it says in the video, by the RUC, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, on the 1st of January 1957 during an attack on a police station. Now, interestingly, trying to get the photo of this was one of the hardest bits of this. Even the Police Service at Northern Ireland Museum couldn't find a picture of a Sten gun in the hands of the RUC. But it's also the second song about the incident that was covered by the Wolf Tones. There was another one, which was called The Patriot Game, which may seem familiar to some of you. The Tom Clancy book and film about the Provisional IRA attack, or splinter of the Provisional IRA attack, and Jack Ryan's dealing with it. That sort of became very, very popular, and sort of re-raised the issue of the Troubles again. So we've still got an establishment set of weapons, but the establishment is now seen as starting to become the villains. By the 1960s and 70s, there was less of a heroic portrayal of war. There were attempts at that. If anyone watches the Dam Busters, the final scene where Richard Todd says he has to write some letters before he can get any sleep, he's referring to writing letters to the dead crew. That's sort of where this is now starting to go. It morphs into, by the 60s, a much more prevalent, really, horror of war approach. It takes time after a war generally for that to happen. It definitely happened after the First World War, and I think there's a similar effect here. And the song, Will You Go to Flanders, Jimmy O, refers to long Lee Enfields. That made me scratch my head when I first saw that one. I'd been thinking short magazine Lee Enfield, the SMLE. But this refers to the long Lee Enfield, and I did a bit of digging, and in all fairness, I should have known better. But the top two rifles being the long Lee Enfields and the short magazine Lee Enfield being at the bottom, you can see the difference. The long Lee Enfield was actually used quite significantly for some time, from 1895 to 1926. So there were plenty of them floating around, and they were definitely used in the First World War. The Lee Enfield being such an incredible design, George MacDonald Fraser in the McAusland books comments that there will still be Lee Enfields going in the hands of guerrillas, bandits and tribesmen long after the modern automatics have all died. And he's very accurate with that. There are still examples having been used in Afghanistan. Now, interestingly, this is the last time that the British Army used a separate rifle and carbine. There was a carbine version of the Lee Enfield that was issued to the cavalry. That was replaced with the short magazine Lee Enfield. It was a universal rifle, or at least it was until comparatively recently, when the L22 stubby carbine was issued alongside the L85 SA80. So it's an interesting return to something that happened previously there. And you'll notice now that the blame has shifted. It's not so much the establishment now, but the actual individual leaders are being identified. And this cynicism is growing. It talks about the First World War, and it talks about the truce on Christmas Day that everybody has heard of, the infamous game of football. It was something that really caught the public consciousness. Although I do find it very interesting that there was an attempt in 1916 on the Eastern Front by the Russians to have a truce with the Bulgarians. So it came to Easter, the Russians got out of their trenches, they walked towards the Bulgarians, and the Bulgarians took them all prisoner. Well, there was a slight problem. The Russians were using the Julian calendar, the Bulgarians were using the Gregorian calendar, which actually meant that Easter was a different date for them. So staying in the same time period, I'm going to be a little bit cheeky here and take a bit of a liberty. We have the MG34, usually called the Spandau by British troops. If you read any account of the time, they don't refer to them as MG34s, MG42s. They are called Spandaus. Technically incorrect, because the Spandau works in Berlin were not involved in the production. They did make the World War I MG08, which probably is where the nickname came from. There are references to Spandaus in First World War books. Now, I've taken the liberty with Spandau Ballet, like I said. There was a big debate sort of in the 70s and the 80s as to where the name Spandau Ballet had come from. One of the theories, which unfortunately isn't true, is it refers to the fact that the Spandau machine gun had such a high rate of fire. When people were being hit with it, they weren't falling, they were being held up by it. The impact of the rounds was throwing them around and they would stay on their feet. I found similar references in Vietnam with the Americans, with the M60. But yeah, unfortunately that wasn't the case. It's referring more to the Spandau prison. So it is appropriate in that sense, though, because it's still really talking about the horror of war. And if it was enough to make that impression, then yeah, it probably is something that we can include in this. That's my excuse, and I'm sticking with it. So the 1980s saw a lot of changes. Now, we actually have a change here. There's a hope starting to appear in the horror. There is a positive, I look forward, sort of hinting at there's a better way. And it's also coinciding with the fact that the weapons are changing. If you think the previous weapons were all World War II, we're now starting to see post-war weapons. So there's sort of a modernization starting to happen. And there is a bit of a passive fight back now against not just, interestingly, the establishment, but also against the people who are creating the horror. So there is a bit of a change. And you can see there the poster is one of the classic provisional IRA posters from the 1980s. In 1981, Bobby Sands was elected as the MP for Fermanagh and South Tyrol. He wasn't allowed to take his seat because he was imprisoned. He undertook a hunger strike for which he actually died. And the Provisional IRA realised this was a step forward for them. And they moved to the policy of the ballot box and the Armalite. In other words, trying to get elected through conventional means, but also using weapons and terrorism. And that policy was only abandoned in 1994, just before the Good Friday Agreement. Now, the weapon involved there is talking about the Armalite. Now, the Armalites in Northern Ireland were mainly smuggled in by the Harrison network from the United States and consisted of the AR-15, the M16, the AR-18, the AR-180. And these were heavily used by the Provisional IRA, mainly for PR. There was a big plus from a PR perspective. They had plenty of AK-47s, AKMs, and so on, but those weren't used as often. Why? Because we're actually talking a cultural thing here. The American weapons are seen as freedom and American and on the side of good. The AK in the West is seen as a weapon of repression. It's carried by communist government troops. there is a distinct difference. There was a slight plus to the M16 in that the sight base was all on the upper receiver, so you could actually strip it down without losing the sighting. That was quite a useful little feature. But the AK was quite a common weapon for them as well. It does feature in the book and TV series Harry's Game, written by Gerald Seymour, who was a journalist in Northern Ireland, and is probably one of the best fictional accounts of the Northern Ireland Troubles. As well as the hope starting to appear, there was also around this point a growth in the technical knowledge, often through computer games. I mean, moving slightly ahead to the 1990s, Rainbow Six being one that I remember spending a lot of time looking at the detail of. And as a result, people do tend to have a better knowledge of certain weapons, provided that the game is accurate. And if anybody is interested in that, can I just suggest you go watch Jonathan Ferguson on YouTube? He has some absolutely brilliant videos talking about the different weapons and how accurate they are. Now, this song, yeah, I think it's hard to get much more technical than this. Let's be honest. Any song that is telling you what colour the tips of blank ammunition is across different countries, that's getting pretty technical. I have to be honest, when I read this song and looked at all the different ammunition types, I was learning. So it is hard to get much more than that. And it is appropriate that really this came sort of out in the same era as the songs featuring the Armalite, because those were the two main opponents of the Cold War. If you then add in the G3 and the FAL, that is pretty much most weapons of that era of the Cold War, in fact. Most of anything else is usually a variant or quite obscure. So the group who sang this, the Sisterhood, is actually a spin-off of the Sisters of Mercy. And there's a lovely little touch. The song itself features in Spooks in the season 7 finale, where a numbers station is broadcasting it. And a numbers station was something that was used in the Cold War, where what they did was broadcast a bit of music and a series of numbers. The music would be the code for which group, and then the numbers would be the individual code. Yeah, it's been well used. We were still using it as well until quite recently, sending broadcasts from Cyprus. But there's a very nice touch in Spooks where the agent is based in Faversham, and the Sisters of Mercy actually used to be based in a pub of that name. And I'm getting a distinct feeling that the author of that episode was a big fan of the Sisters of Mercy and the Sisterhood, because he actually puts a number of other quotes in as well, all referring to their lyrics. Nice touch. So, still sticking with the 1980s, this was quite a revolutionary time. There was another change. There was an increase in activism. So now, instead of almost the passive response that we were seeing with the Armalite, we're now seeing the leaders and authority are now being concentrated on. And the bravery of being out of range, that is a song that really emphasises it's the leaders that are at fault. Now, I find it interesting that there's really an increase in internationalism in the protests as well. The song is a British song, as are all of the others, but the setting is obviously American. We're also starting to see a link between sex and violence with some of the lyrics of the song. And I find it interesting as well that the Uzi is often seen as a bad guy's weapon. It was used very widely by villains in the film of the era. At this point, I could do an Austrian accent and tell you what caliber it is. But there were odd films where it does get used by the hero. Delta Force with Chuck Norris using mini Uzis, and the Dogs of War, it's used to arm some of the the mercenaries there. Really, the first introduction most people got to the Uzi, however, was when Ronald Reagan was shot, and a Secret Service agent whips one out from under his coat. So that was when people started to sort of become aware of it, I think. In the UK, there's also another significant change with yet more firearms legislation after the horrific events of Hungerford, Monks Eaton and Dunblane. So weapon access in the UK becomes less and less. Now, these acts were the Firearms Act of 1988 and 1997 and the Offensive Weapons Act of 2019. The end result is most people in the UK have very, very limited access to firearms. And I think this is one of the reasons that places like the Royal Armouries are so popular, because it's a chance to see them. Now, most people's experience will come from computers. And I've heard a very interesting story of two teenagers arguing about the shape of the bolt on the 303 SMLE when I was at the conference, because they'd seen it on Battlefield 1. It's an interesting thing. But the main physical hands-on would be through things like the cadet forces, as you can see in the picture. And the remoteness of access to weapons really has glorified guns, which is an interesting contrast to the US, where maximum availability with the right to bear arms, which very interestingly also occurred in Britain in the 17th century. So the American right to bear arms probably grew out of British legislation, but British legislation then got rid of it. So where they're almost mythologicized in the States, in the UK they're sort of remote and not seen. So the songs now tend to be about more modern weapons. They tend to be things like the Glock, which is the classic, the SA-80 series. Although I have cheated slightly in the picture. The weapon in the picture is not an SA-80. It's actually the cadet version, the L98A2, which is basically a semi-automatic SA-80, equivalent to the L85A2. Now, for anybody who's ever used the L85 and complained it was unreliable, go use the L98A1. That was a byword for poor reliability. Not only was it single shot, that had to be manually recocked, the slide had been moved with an extension arm to make it easier for the cadet to reach. But the end result was it pivoted, and as soon as there was any water on the slide, as soon as there was any debris, sand, anything like that, the slide would pivot and lock up. It was so unreliable, it's unreal. So if Jamie T had written this song about the L98, I think he would have struggled to find anything positive to say. It definitely wouldn't save him, but let's phrase it that way. Although a cynical friend of mine did say, actually, we're giving weapons to teenagers. Would it be good if they were unreliable? I like that thought. So then, let's actually just pull everything together to conclude. The weapons being sung about have varied. Really, initially, they're all old weapons. You're talking back to the weapons of the First and Second World Wars. Until you get to really about 1970, you start seeing the change. And you then start seeing the more modern post-war weapons. But even then, many of the weapons, particularly in the early period, are very early Cold War weapons, such as the AK and the Uzi. It's really only probably since about 2000 that we're starting to see the more modern weapons. And I think part of that is probably the change in culture, that we now have computer games showing weapons in more depth than anything else. So I think that's probably where the changes come in there. But as to how weapons are seen by society, obviously initially they are part of the establishment, and a positive thing. Gradually, the establishment start to be seen as a negative, and we start getting the hints of revolution. Then we get into the much more cynical 60s and the anti-establishment approach. Weapons are now starting to be seen a little bit more negatively, and they're starting to be seen as an implement of terror. Gradually into the 80s, we start to see a bit of a dawn of hope. We just start to see that change. And we also start to see the increased knowledge starting to occur. Gradually then, we get the activism becoming a bit more international. And we also start seeing the blaming more of the actual leaders rather than the establishment as a whole. Before the weapons really become something that's not used by anybody. I mean, it's a very interesting statistic that 30% of weapons used in crime are actually obsolete calibers where the ammunition is no longer manufactured, often antiques. So there is that lack of availability, that lack of contact other than computer games, with the end result that the songs have become much more technical and more detailed about the weapons. Well, hopefully you found that useful. If you have, please let me know in the comments. And any other songs, particularly British songs, that you can think of about named weapons that you think might make a useful addition if I ever did a second version of this. Thank you very much.